Hi, welcome to Ethics. My name is Mark Thorsby. The year is 2017 and we're in Houston, Texas. Just 2 weeks ago, this neighborhood was decimated by a hurricane-class flood. Water was up to one's chest. And you can see just from the rubble is that the people who live here have been living under pretty difficult circumstances. They've lost everything. In today's video, we're going to be looking at Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, books 1 through 3. And we're going to see that Aristotle offers a sustained discussion on what happiness is. As you can see from the situation here, one of the questions we're going to be asking is, how can one gain happiness in an uncertain world? In a world where storms come one day and take away everything you've ever had, and in some cases, tragically, even your life or the lives of your loved ones, how can you be happy? How can we cultivate happiness in a world of such uncertainty? We're going to see in Aristotle's Ethics today, in Book 1, he offers a discussion of what happiness is. He'll ultimately argue that happiness is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. What does that mean exactly? That's what we'll be exploring. In Books 2 and 3, Aristotle goes on to offer a more detailed discussion of the various virtues. His ultimate view is that happiness is not a feeling. Happiness is not an emotion that one has, but rather happiness is a state of being. And happiness is a state of being in which one is flourishing. And flourishing requires excellency. And in other words, Aristotle argues that in order to live a happy life, you must cultivate virtue. In ancient Greek, the word for virtue was arete, and arete means excellence. So instead of thinking virtue as some sort of spiritual idea that someone has, think of virtue as excellent forms of being in the world, excellent forms of character trait. And Aristotle discusses that we have to have virtue in order to be happy, but we'll see also that that's not simply enough. In other words, virtue is a necessary condition for happiness, although it may not be sufficient. In fact, Aristotle even says that in cases like this, in which people are decimated by tragedy and disaster, it may actually be the case that virtue is not enough and that happiness is simply unattainable. So, Aristotle provides us with, you'll see, a very realistic, although I think quite refreshing and beautiful picture into what it might mean to be happy and how we might achieve it. He discusses, for instance, bravery, courage, justice. He'll also discuss honesty, magnificence, the idea that you ought to help people. One of the things we noticed here in Houston is that when the hurricane came, many people came and gave to other people. People rescued each other. On this very street, men with boats came and evacuated the elderly people that live on this street. So you can see that in times of crisis, oftentimes our character comes into full view. And so that's what we're going to be exploring today with Aristotle's Ethics. And in the back of your head, I want you to be asking this question: how can we be happy in a world of uncertainty? How would I live and deal with tragedies such as this? Thank you very much. We're going to turn now and take a look in detail to Aristotle's Ethics, Book 1. Let's go ahead now and see if we can explore the problem of how it is we can live in an uncertain world, in a world where things are in flux and things are constantly changing, and we want to be happy regardless. Let's now move here and take a look at Aristotle's Ethics. We're going to begin by looking at Aristotle's Ethics, Book 1. And we're going to see that I'm using the Hackett published version of the Nicomachean Ethics and the sort of subtitles they use. What I've done here is I've sort of gone through each of the different sections of Aristotle's Ethics. If you will, Aristotle's Ethics is divided into 10 books, and then each of those books have separate subsections. And so we're sort of going to devote some attention to each of those subsections, so that way as we go through this, you should end up with a fairly comprehensive view of Aristotle's work. And you're going to see, I think, that it also addresses this question that we're asking and we're concerned with regarding the hurricane flooding. So let's begin here. Aristotle begins in this very first quote, which is, "Every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and choice, is thought to aim at some good." Now it's very important that, by the way, I know it says Ari there. Somehow I made a little typo. It should say every art and every inquiry aim towards some good. Now, the first thing here I want to emphasize, and Aristotle doesn't say this, but he's ultimately committed here to what we might call as a teleological worldview. In fact, here, the notion telos is the Greek term that Aristotle uses whenever he discusses the end or the goal towards which a thing aims. And Aristotle has a worldview, a perspective about the way things in nature are, such that in his mind, all things in nature have their own telos, their own end towards which they're directed, their purpose, if you will. Now, of course, he's not talking about any object in the world, but in particular, he says every art and every inquiry. So the art refers to a craft or the way of building or making something. Oftentimes we hear now the discussion of makers, right? Well, makers are artists in this classic Aristotelian sense. But not only every art, but every inquiry, every investigation. So you can see here is that for Aristotle, what he's really saying is that every action and every choice, all human activity is teleological in the sense that it has a purpose, it has a direction, it has an aim. And so you have to really get a sense of Aristotle's ethics, you have to first begin to recognize that he takes on this teleological worldview. But Aristotle continues. He recognizes that there's differences found among ends, and the ends themselves are also many. So what this means is that when we survey the landscape, if you will, give ourselves a panoramic of what human action is and can be, what we see is that all of these actions have purposes, but the purposes are extraordinarily varied, right? And there's a whole bunch of differences between these purposes. So we need to do, if we're going to cultivate a conception of how we ought to act, we have to somehow gain a better understanding about these ends. And we need to determine whether or not the diversity and the plurality of the ends towards which people act can be unified under a single principle, right? And so a key distinction gets made here in this first section, where Aristotle distinguishes the notion that between ends you have subordinate ends and master ends. So for instance, if I want to live a happy life, I also have to have shelter. I have to have a place to live, right? So you can say that, for instance, renting an apartment or buying a house is a subordinate end to a greater master end, right? One doesn't try to live a happy life so that they can own a house or have a nice apartment. Rather, they own a nice apartment in order that they can live a happy life. So we can distinguish here the difference between subordinate and master ends. This will be very important because ultimately what Aristotle wants to do is articulate what he can think of as being the highest end or goal. Now, it's very interesting here, right in this section, we get the discussion of Aristotle's that the highest good and the highest science is political science. And in fact, ethics falls for Aristotle within the domain of political science, or if you will, the science of action among social groups, right, in society, right, hence the political. Now, he says this really important thing, I call it the first hypothesis, because he says, if then there is some end of the things we do which we desire for its own sake, clearly this must be the good and chief end, okay? So first off, Aristotle begins with a hypothesis, and he says there may be something that we actually, an end that we actually pursue, whose goal we desire for its own sake. So this is an interesting hypothesis. Some people don't think this, right? Some people think that everything that you desire, you always desire for something else. But Aristotle is suggesting something really quite different and radical, and I think refreshing. Namely, the idea that some things we desire simply for themselves. We don't desire them for something else, right? So I desire the house to live a happy life, but it doesn't seem like I desire a happy life for anything else. In fact, it appears to be that happiness, we'll see, is something that I desire because I want that in itself. Now, he doesn't really get that far in this second section here, but what he does is he turns to the discussion of politics. And what he was really doing here is, like any good writer, is he's demarcating the field of inquiry. He's articulating what ultimately ethics is about and where it figures in within the larger framework of his work and within our own sort of differences between the various sciences. And what he argues is that politics appears to be the chief good, and it appears to be the master science. Why? Because it appears that the knowledge of how to live, the knowledge of ends, and the knowledge of how we should live and how we ought to act is subordinate to the political, which is concerned with how all of us act and how all of us are good. He gives us this great quote. He says, "For though it is worthwhile to attain the end merely for one man, it is finer and more godlike to attain it for a nation or for a city-states. These then are the ends at which inquiry being concerned with politics aims." And so you can see here this, is that normally when we think about ethics, we think about the individual's actions. And we're going to see really throughout much of the Nicomachean Ethics, and then the other ethical theories we'll be viewing within the video series here, they're really concerned with how the individual should act. But Aristotle's point is well taken, which is namely that individual action is but one strand within the larger, I guess, dance of how people interact with each other at a larger social level. And it appears that the individual's action appears to be a subordinate end to the chief end, which is that of politics. So this is sort of very important. That means that political science is sort of is primary with the domain of human action. Now, one of the things in ethical theory we can talk about is the word axiology. Axiology refers to value theory, or the theory of values, right? And what we can say then is that for Aristotle, within axiology, political science is the highest domain. That is, because political science deals with all of the other values, all of how individuals should act and so on and so forth, how institutions should be arranged, all of that funnels into political science, but not the reverse. And so if you agree with his claim about subordinate and master ends, then you ultimately lead to a sort of conclusion here that says that political science is the greatest end. Now, in this first section, Aerosol is just doing the basic work of getting us to get a sense of what he's arguing. So point 3 here is when Aerosol begins to discuss the method of political science, in particular the method that he's going to be using here. Now, the subject matter, one thing he says that I think is very important and quite wise, is that the subject matter of a discipline is what determines the degree of precision which is possible within that discourse. By the way, I just realized that I'm seeing multiple spelling errors throughout my presentation, so I apologize. Feel free to note it in the comments, but I recognize it automatically just as I read this. But that's an important point, right, is that every subject matter, right, delimits a certain field of inquiry. It highlights a certain class of things that you're going to investigate. And his notion here is that that subject matter is what determines how precise we can be. And if we're talking about the master science, if you will, if we're talking about the thing which has the greatest generality of its science, political science, then that means that we're talking about something that's very large. And that's going to ultimately mean that the field of study is highly pluralized. So for instance, if the science is political science, and then that means that the subject of political science is fine and just action, then that means that what we're going to find is that there's all types of actions which are fine or just, or all types of action that concern the political scientist. And what this means for Aristotle is that methodologically, the truth here can only be articulated in something that's very rough or something that's in an outlined form. So we have to be careful here on how much specificity we want Aristotle to go into. He doesn't think that he can give a lot of specificity. So for instance, if you ask Aristotle, is it better to have, is it more just to have this Republican in office versus that Democrat in office or something like that? Now, apart from the fact that he doesn't know anything about Republicans or Democrats because he lived so long ago, right? What he would say is that the political scientist cannot answer that question because that question is asking for a degree of specificity that can't be given because the field of study itself is so highly pluralized. The goal of any science is to articulate the universal principles which determine the domain of the science. So that is the universal principles that undergird the political science, or for our cases, the principles which undergird right or action or happiness. And that means that we're going to end up with something that's pretty rough. So basically, Aristotle is giving himself an out here and saying, okay, all of those really specific questions you want to ask me, I'm not going to be able to answer, But that's not my fault, right? That's ultimately a consequence of the type of inquiry we're involved in. Now, one of the things he does do right at the end of this section is he compares different types of people. He says, for instance, the youth. Someone who's young is not concerned with political science, partially because they haven't lived life. So they're not as concerned with ethics as such. Because in order to be concerned with ethics, one has to recognize that you can live wrongly. And if you've never lived, then you can't really recognize that lesson for yourself. So that means that Aristotle, like his predecessor, Plato, is a bit skeptical that the youth can fully understand and inculcate philosophical inquiry. Likewise, the incontinent person. Now, the incontinent person is the person who can't control themselves, right? They lack self-control. When they want something, they just go do it, right? I can see I misspelled that as well. But the incontinent person is similar to the youth in that the incontinent person is not really ready to do inquiry or political science or ethics because they can't control themselves. If you can't control yourself, then what's the point of knowing how you ought to control yourself? So this means that the political science and ethics is left to what we might call the reasonable actor. The person who can act and who can act rationally. That is, the person whose actions can be guided by reason is precisely the type of person for whom political science and ethics is something that's appropriate or even worthwhile. So for instance, my children, I have a 8-year-old daughter, and she's a wonderful, beautiful person, and she's smart, but she has not yet fully developed enough knowledge or even the rational capacity to fully understand and make choices in a reasonable way. So for instance, sending her to an ethics class, so hoping that she'll become a better person, is probably not going to work because something else is required until she can develop the faculties and the capacities to become a reasonable actor. So the first thing you have to ask is if we're really concerned with the question of how you can live in an uncertain world, then we can say is that, well, that question is really only an appropriate question for the person who is already a reasonable actor. You have to have rationality and you have to be able to act. Those two conditions are absolutely necessary for this field of inquiry. And so let's move forward here. And what Aristotle then says is, okay, well, let's take a quick survey of what some of the common beliefs are that people hold. He recognizes that the general run of man, as he calls them, and the superior people that we see in our lives all agree that happiness is really the aim of life. And this seems to be true in our own day just as much as it was in Aristotle's. Sorry, my thing's going off here. Let me delete that. Oops. So everyone says they want to have happiness, and that everyone says that they act in order to be happy. So that means that, for instance, the priest has joined the priesthood in order to be happy. It means that the drunkard drinks in order to be happy. It also means that the rich person pursues wealth because they want to be happy. And it also means that the wise person pursues wisdom in order to be happy. So this means that everyone at every level seems to seek happiness. The problem, though, is that they all seem to disagree with regard to what happiness itself is. What exactly is happiness? Is it wealth? Is it honor? Or is it pleasure? Or is it something else entirely? And what we see here is that in Aristotle's day, wealth, honor, and pleasure were the main ones. And I would say today that that's pretty much the same today, except maybe with the distinction between honor. Let me do one thing real fast. Let me just turn off my notifications. Sorry. Okay, let's get back into the presentation here. But one of the things we can see here is that, for instance, people today all want to be well. Many people think that to be happy means to gain lots of money, to become wealthy, right? Certainly there are many people today that think that. And in Aristotle's day, there were people who thought that the goal of life was to gain honor. Happiness was to have honor. And today, we no longer have an honor culture. In fact, there's a great philosopher, Kwame Appiah, who's written a book on this, on the honor culture, or the loss of it in the modern world. But I think that what we have today is not so much a culture of honor, but maybe you might say one of popularity or fame. In other words, some people think that happiness is gained through becoming famous or becoming a celebrity. That is, being honored in the eyes of other people. And of course, so you might say that's the same in the ancient world as it was for us today. We lack sort of the specifics of a culture of honor, I think, today, at least within the United States and the Western world. We don't talk too much about honor, and we don't seem to it doesn't seem to motivate our actions as much. The other possibility, which seems highly likely, is that happiness might be pleasure, right? So many people think that happiness is pleasure. They thought this in Aristotle's day. People think it today. If you don't believe me, just go to a music festival and people are all having a good time. And it looks like people think that happiness is pleasure. Because after all, if you ask people, are you having a good time? They'll say, yes, I am. I'm very happy tonight, or something like this. So you can see here is it wealth, is it honor, is it pleasure, or is it something else? Now, Aristotle aims ultimately to examine the most prevalent theories in his starting view of the subject. He knows that there are other answers potentially besides these three, but he says these are the big ones that most people seem to be interested in, they seem to pursue. We might say wealth, fame, and pleasure. Now, there is a sort of methodological point here that Aristotle raises right at the end. And if you haven't read Plato before, you may not have been as acutely able to recognize the discussion. One of the things here to recognize is that in the discussion of ethics and political science, Aristotle uses what we call, or what I would call, is an empirical approach. Man, my spelling's bad. I've misspelled so many things in here. Anyway, that's not how you spell empirical. The I comes before the R. But Aristotle says that you have to uses an empirical approach. That means that Aristotle looks to the world around him and says, well, how do people live? That is, how do people live who are happy? Let's take a stock of our experience and then analyze it in the discussion. Now, this is different than Plato, who utilizes what's known as the method of division, which is sort of rationalistic approach. That is, Plato would want it to define what happiness is without looking to the way people live. Define it in terms of its own terms by dividing the concepts of the definition apart and then eventually sort of building out a more fleshed out conception. And so Aristotle addresses this because he knows that the primary readers of his own day are people who are very familiar with Plato and the theory of the forms, and they'll see that as a critical problem. Namely that one of the things you'll notice is, why should Aristotle start by sort of asking, well, what are the different views that people have? Plato would say, who cares what the different views that people are? Instead, let's just figure out what happiness is regardless of other people's views. So you see sort of a difference of methodology here. A difference, maybe you might say there's an empirical approach in Aristotle and maybe a rationalistic approach in Plato. This point actually is taken up in a more, I think, nuanced and interesting discussion by John Wilde, who's sort of kind of a philosopher from around the late 40s and 50s and 60s. And I think his argument would be that, well, the difference actually is that Plato has a more practical approach, whereas Aristotle has a more theoretical approach. So there is debate about this. I'm not going to go too much into that, but I do want you to recognize that in this discussion, there's a lot of things going on. And one of them is that Aristotle is also sort of marking out the field of territory between himself and his earlier teacher, Plato, as well as all of the different people in Plato's academy of the same day. Now, here's a great quote I want to end with here, which is Aristotle says, quote, "For while we must begin with what is familiar, things are so in two ways. Some things are familiar to us, while some are familiar without qualification. Presumably, then, we must begin with things that are familiar to us." So Aristotle's suggestion is that happiness is a sort of familiar idea, and we're familiar with happiness, and that it seems best to begin with things which are most familiar to us, instead of beginning with things that can be known without qualification. So Aristotle's sort of trying to protect and make an argument for the way in which he's approaching the subject matter here. Excuse me. So, in section 5 here, Aristotle turns and he begins to distinguish. He really begins by saying, okay, well, if we want to think about happiness and the way people achieve it, we have to begin, and we think about our experience here, we have to begin by thinking about how do people actually live. And so this is not simply the idea that we should say, well, what do people say happiness is? We should actually look to the way people live. Because the way people approach happiness is given by the content and the form of life that people take on. So it looks like there's three basic forms of life that Aristotle was going to distinguish here. The first is the most common, which is the life of enjoyment, right? Quote, to judge from the lives that men lead, most men and men of the most vulgar type seem, not without some good reason, to identify the good or happiness with pleasure. Okay? So you can see here is that Aerosol begins with the notion that many people live a life of enjoyment. They live to have pleasure. The second sort of life is what he calls the political life. And this is a life that gets identified with honor. And here, since we no longer live in an honor culture the way that I think Aristotle did, what we can say here is that the political life would be a social life, a life that's identified with serving others in one way or another, a life of citizenry, right? And this in many ways seems to be better than a life of enjoyment. And here we can imagine many different people, right? So for instance, the life of enjoyment, I can imagine the student who sits in my class who really actually spends most of their time smoking pot, right? And partying and not really studying philosophy. That's all right. We've all been there. I can understand that sort of life. But that's a life of enjoyment. Now, the political life is a life where someone is perhaps civically engaged. So for instance, imagine a student at a university in the same class who's more interested in, working on social justice issues, raising awareness about specific issues that they're interested in and whatnot. Now, this is a sort of political life, and it is identified with honor, and it's identified with the way in which we relate to other people. But Aristotle recognized that although this seems to be better than a life of pure pleasure or enjoyment, it also appears to be incomplete. For the excellence of honor is compatible with being asleep and enduring great suffering. But a man who was living so, no one would call happy unless he was maintaining a thesis at all cost. So Aristotle's point here is this, is that the person who lives, if happiness is identified with the political life, then it looks like happiness is honor. Well, if happiness is honor, someone could be honorable but live in misery, right? Someone who's honorable can have lots and lots of great suffering, right? Imagine, for instance, if there's a serviceman, a military person who's captured in war, and then they're imprisoned and tortured for 20 years before being released. You might say that they have a lot of honor, but Aristotle's sort of saying here, you wouldn't really say that they lived a happy life. So it doesn't look like happiness is good enough thing to say there. And if someone did say that the person who's in a prison camp and tortured or something like this, if someone maintained that they were happy, then it looks like they're just maintaining it to win the argument. They're just trying to maintain a thesis, right? The third possible life is the contemplative life. And of course, this is the life of the philosopher. Aristotle in this section doesn't really talk much about the contemplative life, and that's because he's saving it for later, actually. He's going to get to it in a couple later books from now, in which he is going to argue that the contemplative life is a life worth living, right? But he sort of says, okay, let's start with these three. And you can say, by the way, the person who lives a contemplative life, I guess, would be a philosopher, a professor, or someone like this. Or a priest would maybe potentially live a contemplative life. Can you tell what kind of life you live, right? That's one of the things I want you to think about as you're watching this video is, what kind of life am I living? And there what you can do is you say, just take a look at the sorts of actions that you actually engage in. And ask yourself, what is the sort of central principle that's guiding those actions? Well, if you spend most of your time trying to have a good time and go to parties and enjoy things, then you're living a life of enjoyment or pleasure. If you find that you're engaging and giving your life over to activities in which you're engaged with others and citizenship and honor and these sorts of things, then perhaps you're living a political life. And if you're engaged in a life of contemplation, that is, you are constantly reflecting on how to live and then using that as its own sort of principle for life, then that's the contemplative life. Now, many of you might be thinking, well, that's not the kind of life I live. What about the person who says that happiness is wealth, right? And this would indicate that can't you have a life of money making? And what Aristotle says, though, is that the problem is that the life of money making is a life that seems to be taken under compulsion. That is, when people, and all of us to a certain degree, live a life of money making in which we spend our life doing things in order to make more money, we're doing these not because we want money, right? But we do them because we want other things which require money, which means that the life of money making appears not to be a free life. The life of money making appears to be something that is directed by a compulsion that's outside of ourselves. And since this is the case, it's not something that we can choose as such. So the life of money making and the possibility of wealth as happiness sort of gets abridged right from the beginning in this discussion. Now next in section 6 here, yeah, that's right. In section 6, Aristotle begins to discuss the Platonic form of the good. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail on this. I encourage you to take a look at my other videos that are posted on Plato's theory of the forms, just to give you some of the sense here. But there is this quote that he gives, which is, piety requires us to honor truth above our friends. And there's this notion here that Aristotle thinks, while he's in very much agreement with Plato and the people who argue for the theory of the forms in Plato's Academy while Aristotle is writing this, well, he's very much agreed with a lot of their ideas. He doesn't agree with all of them. And he doesn't agree with the doctrine of the form of the good in particular. And he's sort of being nice here, but saying that even though there are friends, we have to ultimately the philosopher has to discuss and articulate what is true. And that means that truth comes before friendship. And so given that, he then develops something of an attack or a critique of Plato's theory of the forms. Now, without going into the theory of the forms, what we can say is that in the theory of the forms, Plato's notion was that the universe is sort of composed between two different realms. The realm of becoming, where things change, that's the world we experience, and the realm of being, where things don't change, but this is a realm that our minds can access. So for instance, I can study triangles in mathematics with my mind, and I can gain insight into eternal truths about mathematics. That is, I can know that a triangle has 3 sides, and that's true eternally, no matter where I go in the universe or at what point. But triangles I see in the world are coming and going. They're passing in and out of existence. And this sort of created a problem for Plato, which was, how is it possible for us to have knowledge of things in the world when everything in the world itself is in a state of change or in a state of flux? And his solution was to argue that, well, while the material realm is changing, the realm of ideas and the realm by which our minds or our souls can access does not change. And they're eternal. And this meant that, obviously, since our minds can access eternal truths, we too must be eternal. And so he had a theory of the immortality of the soul. Now, all in all, without going into a lot of detail here, this general theory becomes known as the theory of the forms, in which knowledge of the particular things in the world are always given by an inspection of the general forms of concepts with which they participate. So for instance, I'm a human being and you're a human being if you're watching this, I assume. And think of if you go to a crowd, there's all these different people. Well, how do you know what it means to be a human being, right? And his answer Plato's answer was that to know what a human being is, to know that this person here is a human being, required some sort of recognition of the form of what humanness as such was, right? And so Plato ultimately articulates that all of our ideas are rested in these eternal transcendental forms that exist in a different dimension or a different plane than the material existence we're enjoying. In fact, that the material existence is derivative of this eternal realm of the forms. So in general, this is known as the theory of the forms. And Plato ranked all of the forms, all concepts, into a hierarchy. And at the top of the hierarchy was what Plato called the good, right? And his notion here was that all knowledge was good. And the reason all knowledge was good was because that all forms of knowledge participate in this still more universal form of goodness, or the good. And of course, it seems to be identified with the divine as well. So this is a general notion of the theory of the forms. Now, this is interest Aristotle here, because Aristotle has to recognize that he's basically tackling the problem of ethics and the good in a very different sense. at least from a different vantage point. And he says that this is what Aristotle says, is that for Plato, there was never a distinction between what's prior and what's posterior, or posterity and priority. In other words, that what has priority is that which comes before, and that which is posterior is that which comes afterwards. And we can distinguish this between logical priority and logical posterity. So for instance, you can say that take two stones that are stacked on top of each other. If you've ever played that game Jenga, right, where you stack all these little pieces of wood together, right? What you naturally know is that while all of the pieces or all the stones are standing there together, so in time they're all in the same point, the stone at the very bottom, or the piece of wood at the bottom of the blocks, has the logical priority. Why? Because everything rests upon it. So if you pull the wrong stone at the bottom, the rest of the house will fall down. And this indicates a difference between priority and posteriority. So you can say that the cornerstone of a building has the logical priority to the roof, and the roof is logically posterior to the cornerstone because it's a logical relationship. But the problem is that in Plato, there is no logical relationship between posterity and priority. His theory was that one form participates in another form, and which participates in another form. And while there is some sense of hierarchy, this is not the same as posterity or priority. Not in the same way that Aristotle employs it, given his own categorical logic and his own theory of logic. Take a look at the categorical logic videos I've posted, for instance. Now, the second thing that Aerosol notes is that the goodness of things within the theory of the forms emanates from this eternal form of the good, of which all good actions participate in. Okay, so this means that at the end of the day, the good is really just one thing. It's the highest being, and it is also eternal. But here's the problem, that if the goodness is eternal, that means the good never changes. Well, if the good never changes, then you can see there's a difficulty here in understanding the way in which we can talk about some ends being good, the way in which we can talk about all ends being good, but some things are sought for their own sake and some aren't. And so that doesn't quite make sense from the Platonic side of the equation. What Plato would say is that things are good in terms of their substance, their quality, and their relation. That is, things are good either in terms of their very being, or the quality of their being, or they're good in terms of their relationship to other beings, right? So for instance, think about in terms of the substance. So I'm a human being. I have 2 legs and 2 arms, right? And I have 10 fingers on my hands here. Now you can, in my substance, imagine if I was missing a finger, right? And I only had 9 fingers, 9. I can't do it well. Imagine I had 9 fingers. Well, you could say that that was a diminishment of the goodness of my substance, my physical being. You can also imagine that, take the difference between a person who's honest and a person who's a liar. That's a difference in the quality of a person. And then also there can be a difference in terms of the relation. So for instance, you can say that, not to be too cute here, but you can say is that the teacher, think of the relationship between a teacher and a student, right? The teacher is a good teacher only in relationship to their student, right? And a student is only a good student in relationship to their subject matter. So there's different relations which determine whether or not someone is good within their position. Now, all of this is what the theory of the forms would think, but what this means is that consequently, the theory means that the good is the same for all people in all situations, as it's eternal and unchanging. But the problem is, it's pretty clear, is that what's good is also situational. Or in other words, as situations change, what's good seems to change. And the doctrine of the forms and the form of the good doesn't seem to be sufficient for answering or explaining that. In fact, Aerosol suggests that the Pythagorean theory, so the Pythagorean doctrine of the good is better, because in the Pythagorean sense, things which are good just simply fall within a category of things which are goods, rather than trying to identify them all within being itself. So this means that there's really sort of 2 different ways we can talk about things being goods. On the one hand, things are either good in themselves, or number 2, things are good because in some way they serve things which are good in themselves. And what this means is that therefore not all goods are simply one. you can see here is that he's going to say that happiness is something that is good in and of itself, but that, for instance, gaining wealth is only good insofar as it serves happiness, right? So there's two ways of talking about these goods, and they can't all be identified in the same way that the theory of the forms would indicate. So this now enables Aristotle to move to his sort of seventh section here, which is a discussion on the account of the human good. Now, we've already talked about there being a difference between ends in themselves and ends for the sake of which, right? So something is an end in itself if you desire it for its own sake, right? And something is an end for the sake of which if it is desired for the sake of something else. And the question here is which one of these are better? And what he argues here is that the ends which we seek for in themselves are complete. That is, we desire them simply for themselves, so they're complete in and of themselves. Whereas these other ends, what we might call the subordinate ends, these are incomplete because they only serve the greater purpose. So in other words, happiness is a complete end that I seek, but gaining money is an incomplete end because I can gain money but still not be happy. But if I'm happy, that's enough, right? So what we have here is a difference between completion and incompletion regarding the human good, right? He says happiness then is something complete and self-sufficient and is the end of action, okay? So you can see here is that the goal of human action ultimately is going to be something that is A, complete, and B, self-sufficient. That is, it's something that's good enough in itself. We don't need, it's sufficient for us. It's sufficient for the self, if you will. Now, he says, okay, when we look at human life, because if we're going to talk about the good, okay, so whatever the good is, it's both complete and self-sufficient, but what about it, the sense in which it's a good for a human being? Well, there's three different ways in which we can talk about life. On the one hand, life can refer to the idea that we the need of nutrition and the development of growth, like plants have. Life can also refer to the ability to perceive the world around you, like the way our animals and our pets do. But human life also includes a third part, which concerns the ability to reason or have rationality. And it's ultimately this third type of life, the rational, that Aristotle is ultimately interested in. So let's take a moment here. Okay, sorry, my daughter is over here doing something. Okay. Now, ultimately what Aristotle thinks is that the human good, the basic complete end that we're seeking, doesn't concern nutrition and growth or perception, but it concerns human reason, okay? And what he's ultimately going to say is that it also seems to have something to do with virtue or excellence. Now, I'm going to use these terms interchangeably to say that virtue, or whenever Aristotle used the term virtue, it's the same word for excellence. So it depends on the translation you're using. In some translations of Aristotle's Ethics, it'll say virtue, and others it'll say excellence. But as I mentioned earlier, the Greek word is arete there. And excellence is probably the best way to think about it. Because what he's going to say ultimately is that happiness is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. Now, Aristotle's view here is that the soul, there's three types of souls. There's the soul of nutrition and growth, the soul of perception, and then there's the soul of rationality. And what he means is that happiness is an activity of the rational soul in accordance with excellence, with the conditions for excellence. Now, one of the other things that's very important here for Aristotle is that when we talk about happiness, happiness is something that only applies to a complete life. A complete life is required. In other words, is that Aristotle doesn't think that a child can be said to have happiness because a child doesn't have a complete life. And because a child doesn't have a complete life, we can't really say that they have excellence. Now, I didn't really go through it here. I forgot to put on the slides here. Is that for Aristotle, happiness, the Greek term he uses there is eudaimonia. And eudaimonia is best translated as something like human flourishing, right? The idea of being successful or something like this, right? In all areas of your life. And you can think here that happiness is not an emotional state for Aristotle. Happiness is not a psychological state. Happiness is a state of being. It's the state of flourishing in the world in which you live. Now, we all know people who flourish, and we all know people who have tried but failed to flourish. And what Aerosol thinks is that at the end of the day, in order to judge whether or not a person has achieved happiness, really requires an inspection of their entire life, because even people who flourish and do well have bad years. So for instance, when we were walking through and we were looking at the devastation from the recent hurricane flooding, what we see there is that is something that there's tragedy involved. There are people lost things, and you certainly would not say that someone whose house has been flooded and gutted is flourishing. But it's also clear that simply because someone endures a flood one year doesn't mean that their chances for happiness are over, right? Because there's still more time. So in other words, you can't really judge happiness without judging a complete life. Now, what's needed in order to investigate this for Aristotle is, number one, we need facts, but facts themselves are not enough. So we can't just point to people and say that this person's happy and look, this person does X, Y, and Z. That's not enough. We have to also know the causes of happiness. What are the principles that enable happiness to occur, that enable excellence and virtue, and that enable human flourishing and success? Now, for Aerosol, there's four types of cause, right? There's a material cause. So you can say that, so for instance, I have a pen right here. The material cause of the pen is the principle of its material matter, right? So it's plastic. The formal cause refers to the principle which governs its formal structure, the fact that it's a pen. The efficient cause refers to the person who made it. I don't know who made this, but imagine somewhere there's a factory where they make these pens. And the efficient cause would be the manufacturer. But finally, the final cause is the purpose or the aim towards which a thing is created. So you can say that the final cause of a marker is to mark, right? The final cause of a pen is to write. So whenever we talk about causes, we can break these causes down into four different ways. So not only do we need facts in order to investigate happiness, we need to understand what the causes of happiness are. The material causes, the formal causes, the efficient causes, as well as the final causes. And a cause, again, is the principle of a thing. So what are and we have to also employ, in Aristotle's sense, a variety of methods. On the one hand, we're going to use inductive reasoning. We're going to take a look at particular cases and try to extrapolate the probabilities from those cases. We're also going to utilize reasoning from first principles, right? Reasoning from first principles is when you start with what is most certain and then deduce step by step what follows from that. We're also going to need to employ reasoning from perception. So we need to experience the world and recognize that our experience can teach us about the nature of things. There's also reasoning from habituation, in which Aristotle argues that we have to also investigate the means by which habits are created. There's also other forms of methods that he's going to employ here. In other words, you're going to see is that in Aristotle's ethics, you get a sort of basket full of a whole bunch of different methods that he ultimately wants to employ. Ultimately, his view is that all of these different methods have to harmonize with each other such that they're consistent. And so in section 8, he offers us brief defense on his approach. He says that for the true view of all the facts harmonize, but with the false one, they soon clash. So his argument, though, is that the more we investigate what harmonizes and syncs together, what's consistent with our other claims is probably what's true. And things which are contradictory or conflict would not be. Sorry, I keep getting interrupted while I'm making this video. Okay, so there's accordingly three types of goods that we can also talk about. There are things that can be good, which are just external situations, things that are external to us. Things can also be good in terms of the body. And we can also talk about the goods of the soul. So for instance, imagine this. Living in a world without pollution would be an external good, right? Or no, I'm saying living in a world where there's democratic freedom of speech would be an external good. Having health would be a good of the body. Having the ability to think clearly would be a good of the soul. Okay, so, and what he's going to ultimately argue is that the virtue we're interested in is not really external goods or goods of the body, but ultimately goods of the soul. And that's because of the relationship of rationality and reason. He's going to ultimately argue that virtue is really the chief ingredient for understanding happiness. The life of virtue is both best and pleasant on his view, and it's identified with happiness, which is itself a form of excellence. Okay. So let's keep moving here. So how can we achieve happiness? And this is the big one. He says, is happiness gained by learning? Is it gained by habit? Or is it gained by some other sort of training? Hold on a second here. Okay, sorry about that. I keep getting interrupted, so my apologies. Right. So is happiness gained through learning, gained through habit, or some other training? We're going to see that it really requires all of those ultimately, right? But he doesn't answer those questions here. He just sort of raises the questions. He also asks, is happiness divine providence? That is, are some people fated to be happy, or is happy the result of chance? Well, he says we can't leave the matter to chance because otherwise there's no point, right? So he really suggests that happiness seems to be the result of reasoning, which is consistent with Aristotle's view that happiness is an activity of the rational soul. Now, it does raise this problem, though, in section 10, which is, can we be happy in our own lifetime? If complete excellence is required to be happy, and complete excellence or complete virtue requires a complete life, or in other words, you need complete excellence in a complete life, then you have to ask yourself, well, wait a second, can I ever know if I'm happy? And the answer there is no, because you have not lived a complete life, so you don't know if you're actually living a flourishing life until you're dead. But the problem is, once you're dead, you can't know. So you can see here there's this sort of weird paradox that Aristotle confronts here, which is namely that happiness, in its really strict theoretical sense, if it really does require a complete life, is not something that can ever be known by the individual who's actually leading that life. So in other words, there's always a sort of degree of provisionality or probability to whether or not we'll be happy. But that seems to accord and be consistent with our intuition that we might not actually be happy. And maybe that's one of the motivational reasons for why we're always trying to achieve happiness, right? He says one of the other things that's sort of weird here is that happiness can be changed after you die. So in other words, you have a bit of a methodological problem here, where we can look at how people live, and then based upon our observations of how they live, we can make judgments based upon our knowledge of them. But the problem is that knowledge is frequently incomplete. We don't know everything about everyone else. And what this means is that he says the misadventures of our friends can force us to revise our initial judgments. So in other words, you can imagine knowing a person and thinking, wow, they lived a really happy life, and then maybe after they've died or something, you discover that actually they had been cheating on their wife, they'd been stealing money from work, and that they were actually a fairly miserable alcoholic, right? If you found all that out, well, then suddenly you would change your view about whether or not they were happy. So it does look like the happiness of a person can be revised or affected after death. And so this is kind of weird, but it does make sense in fact, right? But what Aerosol suggests is that, so if you've known a person your whole life and then they die, it's true that maybe their happiness can be affected after their death, but of degree, not of kind, or at least in most cases, right? Because usually we don't discover that someone is a scoundrel and we've only experienced them as a saint, right? It's typically that people who are scoundrels act like scoundrels even when we know them. But this does raise, the point here is not so much practical, I think, but ultimately methodological. And it relates to some of the, I think he's trying to encounter some of the challenges he suspects that the theory of the forms or the Platonic school might charge against him. Now, one of the things is going to the question of sort of praise and honor, and that is happiness something to be praised or is it something to be prized? That is happiness something that we should judge as great and we should, praise it, or is it a prize? Is it an object that we should seek to attain ourselves? Now, praise is always something that's relative to something else, whereas something which is prized is something which is valued for itself, right? So when I praise someone else for being a fast runner, well, I'm praising them according to sort of a relationship. I'm comparing people and that sort of thing. But if I want to run fast, why do I want to run fast? I want to run fast for its own sake, right? It's something I'm valuing itself. Now, I don't know. I guess you could debate whether or not running counts in that regard, but you can say that happiness does. We don't just praise happiness; we prize it. We seek to attain it, and this is because praise is appropriate to sort of excellence and virtue. But happiness itself, insofar as it is a complete end, is something which is prized and complete. Okay, so next here, Aristotle then he begins to introduce the virtues. And as I've already mentioned, he argues that happiness is an activity of the soul, the rational soul, in accordance with complete excellence or virtue. But the question is, what sorts of activities are these activities of excellence? That is, what concerns us are the activities that come to fruition through the rational element of the soul. And here Aristotle begins to distinguish between the intellectual virtues and the moral virtues. And here we can make the distinction by saying that the intellectual virtues are those forms of excellence which are related to the mind, to the rational operation of the mind, whereas the moral virtues are those forms of excellence which are related to action and activity. Okay, remember, the word moral comes from the root word of custom. We're talking about the things that one does, the way in which people live and act in the world. So intellectual, we've all known people who are smart but didn't know how to live or act in the world. They had intellectual virtue but potentially lacked moral virtue. So first, by distinguishing this, we then can get a sense of where we can go from here. So that's sort of what book 1's all about. Let's now jump into book 2. Okay, and I know this video series is a bit long, but we're going to try to get through it best we can. So the first section here he goes in book 2 is he asks, well, okay, how is virtue acquired? We've already mentioned that virtue is excellence. And so, for instance, it looks like the intellectual virtue or intellectual excellence is the result of teaching, whereas moral virtue, the excellence of acting well, is the result of habit. Now, habits are really interesting because we all have them, and habits are actually neurological, such that once we learn to do one thing, we continue to do that thing over and over. And the notion here is that most of our actions are actually the result of habit. Think about it. Most of the actions you actually do in your day-to-day life, you don't actually sit and contemplate. You don't even think about. You just do them. For instance, we've heard of people who've saved other people. Years ago in New York, there was a gentleman there was a woman who was I think it was on the 6th train in Grand Central, and she had an epileptic fit and collapsed on the subway platform as a train was coming. Another gentleman, he's standing there with his son, he ran and jumped into the track and pulled out and saved the woman. They asked, right, and that would be something we'd certainly consider to be moral virtue. And so they asked this guy later, they said, you're a hero. And he said, I'm not a hero. And they said, well, why did you do it? And he said, I did it because I was trained in the military. In other words, it was simply habit, right? So it does look like there's some degree to which most of our actions are actually just repetitiously ingrained in us, and we don't really think about them. They're habits. And so there does seem to be something right about thinking about that our moral virtues are acquired through habit. Aerosol says, quote, that none of the moral excellences arise in us by nature, for nothing that exists by nature can come from a habit that's contrary to its nature. So in other words, the moral virtues don't arise in us by nature. They have to be cultivated in us, right? Because after all, if they were purely natural, we would always be virtuous, and we're not. And he also adds, quote, neither by nature then, nor contrary to nature, do excellences arise in us. Rather, we're adopted by nature to receive them and made perfect, and are made perfect by habit. So his notion here is that we have a natural capacity for virtue, but that these virtues have to be developed over time in the habits that we live. And this is sort of interesting. He sort of relates this to politics by saying that this is sort of interesting because it means that, given the discussion of political science here, is that legislators make citizens good by creating the good habits for the citizens to live by. So this is sort of a very interesting idea here, is that maybe that part of what the goal of the legislature is, the goal of politics, is not simply to have impartial laws, but to create laws which can create the right conditions for the right sorts of habits to be created. There's also a way of thinking about here is that we can talk about individual habits. We can also talk about institutional habits. So maybe that's what legislators are also interested in achieving, is institutional forms of habituation. One moment here. Okay, so Aristotle adds then that it makes no small difference then whether we form habits of one kind or another from our very youth. In fact, it makes a very great difference, or rather all the difference. So Aristotle also recognizes that in order to... Sorry again, since the hurricane, it's been very difficult to record these videos in a place where it's quiet. So I apologize, my children keep running through the door. Anyway, right, speaking of my children, right, but Aristotle's point here is that the thing here is that he recognized that habits have to be developed when we're young, such that it makes all the difference of the sorts of habits we have. Now think about that. Aristotle is one of the greatest people of all time, the greatest minds. And what does one of the greatest minds say? He says that the only way he could develop this intellectual virtue of being such a great mind was precisely by developing the right habits from a very young age. So this is sort of why it's really important for parents to try to cultivate habits in their children. So this leads to the discussion of habituation in general. What we find are sort of three key points I want to emphasize here. Number one is that the nature of things is such that things are destroyed by excess and deficiency, by excess and defect. So what we find is that you can take anything. So here I have an iPhone, right? If I use the iPhone too much, then I'll kill the battery, right? I'll use it to excess. But think, if I never charge it, I'll also kill the battery. So I can also, the battery can be destroyed by the deficiency of charging it, or that's what we might call a defect. So the nature of things is that either if you have too much or too little, excess or deficiency, things can be destroyed. And it looks like habituation is about finding the middle point or the intermediary point between these excesses and these deficiencies, the excesses and the defects. So virtues, and this is because virtues are also destroyed by excess and defect. So for instance, imagine here about the courageous person. The person who has the courage, that's the excellence of action under fear, right? Excellence there can be destroyed by being too excessive, right? So the courageous person who just runs into battle and has no fear ultimately will be destroyed. And the person who lacks courage, who is frozen under fear, has a deficiency. And so the virtues themselves fall somewhere between this space between the excessive and the deficient. And this seems to mean that habits provide a practical ground for moderating action so that we can guard against excess and deficiency. And this looks to be what, from Aristotle's perspective, is the very purpose of habits. Habituation, we find habits to find ourselves the right position either between excess and deficiency. Okay, let me take a moment. Okay, so in section 3 here, Aristotle then begins to discuss pleasure and pain. And this, of course, is important because we all know that we want to live a pleasurable life. We all know we avoid pain. Now the question is, and we all know that some people think that the enjoyable life is completely centered around that. But it is important to recognize that ethics, even in its most proper sense, is also concerned with pleasure and pain. Aristotle says it over and over, is that it looks like most people act wrongly because of pleasure, right? People break their marital vows because they want to have pleasure with another person, right? Whether or not, either even psychological or sexual or whatever, right? It looks like pleasure is what motivates us to act in the wrong way. Also, we punish people who are bad. So we give pain to people who are bad. So it's clear that pleasure and pain do have a role in ethics, at least by our first initial inspection in terms of how we actually act. Now, it looks like he says that there's sort of 3 objects of choice and 3 objects of avoidance. Or in other words, maybe 3 categories for choosing and 3 categories of avoiding. And the 3 objects of choice are the noble, the advantageous, and the pleasant. And this all makes sense. People choose things because it's the right thing, the noble thing to do. People also choose certain things because it's advantage. It gives them an advantage. And the other thing is people choose things because they're pleasurable in themselves. That is, they're pleasant. But people also avoid things because they're base, or they cause injury, or because they're painful. And so you can see here is that what Aerosol wants to do is he's not a hedonist, and he doesn't think that happiness is pleasure, but he does think that pleasure and pain have an important role within our ethical considerations. Because they motivate us in so many ways. They motivate our choices, and they also motivate what we avoid. So let's move here now to an important distinction that Aristotle makes, and that's the distinction between virtuous action on the one hand and virtuous character on the other. There's this beautiful phrase that Aristotle says, and when asked how we can become just, Aristotle suggests that one becomes just by doing just acts. That is, the honest person is the person who acts honestly. The courageous person is the person who acts courageously under conditions of fear. Right? So it looks like our action is what determines our character. But even though the two are related, Aristotle takes great pains to make sure we recognize there's something different between them. And this is because just actions can be taken for the wrong reasons, right? I can tell you the truth, I can be honest with you because I want to hurt your feelings, right? I want to cause you pain or harm. And so you can see that sometimes doing what's just in terms of the action can be taken for the wrong reasons, which indicates that someone with bad character can actually perform the right action. So this means that the agent must actually be in a certain condition while they act to actually be considered just. So what are those conditions? It looks like Aristotle identifies 3 such conditions. The first condition is that the just person has to have knowledge of what's just. They have to know what they're doing. The second thing is that the just person has to choose the act for themselves, the act for itself. They have to want to do what's just because they know it's just. By the way, I recognize there's a number of spelling and typo errors, so my apologies to you watching this video. I obviously didn't have enough time to properly vet this. Number 3, the just person has to have a firm and unchangeable character. Or in other words, the person who has a character trait of virtue maintains that virtue under different circumstances. So he gives the example of the temperate man, right? The person who's temperate is a person who knows how to choose rightly among the pleasures, right? And they know when they've had enough, right? They have self-control. So that means that the temperate person has to have knowledge of what is self-control, but they also have to choose to have self-control because they desire it for itself. And finally, they have to also maintain that sort of temperance throughout their life. It has to be unchangeable. So it looks like the difference between virtuous action and virtuous character rests upon the distinction between these 3 different conditions. Okay, number 5. What is the genus of virtue? Now remember, in Aristotle, he's a logician, so there's this distinction between a genus and a species. The genus is that which is higher than the species, right? So I'm a Homo sapien, so Homo is the genus and sapien is the species, right? It's the class and the subclass, the category and the subcategory. Okay, so what is the overarching category for virtue or excellence? Well, here Aristotle says the soul has 3 sorts of things, or whenever we talk about human action, we're talking about what a person can reasonably do. And that means that we're talking about the soul, or, if you will, the psyche of a person. And that includes their passions, their emotions, it includes their faculties, and it also includes their states. So which one of these is an excellence or a virtue? Is it a passion? No. He doesn't think it's a passion because we don't judge people's moral character based upon their passions and emotions, right? When a person finds out that their child has been murdered and they want revenge, right? We don't judge the person's moral character based upon that emotion or state they have. We judge the person based upon their actions. In other words, we judge the person based upon their states. I'm jumping ahead of myself because he's going to say B is that virtue is not a faculty either. We have faculties by nature, but we don't praise or blame people based upon their account, right? Just because people have a capacity to do something or lack a capacity doesn't give us the right to judge them based upon it. It just is factual. So that means that virtues have to be states of being, right? And this is because we do judge people based upon their actions, and actions refer to a state of activity, a state of being. So the genus of virtue is a virtue of, it refers to or is coordinated with the state of being that people can have. Okay, so what are how do we understand the differences of virtue? Or in other words, what sort of state is a virtue? Well, excellence can do two things. On the one hand, excellence can bring something into good condition. Excellent virtue brings into good condition the thing of which it is an excellence, right? So courage brings courage into good condition, right? The courageous into good condition. But number two, an excellence or a virtue makes the work of that thing done well, right? So you can see here is that when someone acts excellently, they make themselves more excellent, but they also make the thing that they're working on more excellent as well. So it looks like here that the master of any art will avoid the excess and the deficiency and always instead seek the intermediate of something. Not in the object, but the thing which is intermediate relative to us. In other words, if we say that virtue or excellence is the midpoint between excess and deficiency, that relationship is a relationship that has to do with me as well. And so that means that the virtues are individual to each person. Because, for instance, different people have different habits, they have different histories, etc., different problems. And given all of that, what it means is that what may be excessive to me may be virtuous to you and vice versa. And so that means is that there is no one virtue for all people. Virtue is rather a form of a state of being that is conducive or relative to each individual person. So you can say here is that what it means is that excellence or virtue is a mean. It is the mean between excess and deficiency. Now, it's sort of interesting is, can you have a virtue of drunkenness or the vice of acting justly? In other words, can you have, it looks like some things are really just always wrong and there's no middle point at all, right? In other words, for some things there is no intermediate, for there can be no mean of an excess itself or of a deficiency of itself, nor an excess of a deficiency of a mean. In other words, Aristotle is saying here is that some people might say, well, wait a bit, what about lying? Is there a virtue of lying? That is, lying too much or not lying enough? Aristotle doesn't think that because he thinks that lying is always a type of excess. Or a deficiency. It's always a deficiency of the truth or an excess of power or something like that. And so some things, some forms of activity are always wrong. So there is no virtue of drunkenness, and there is no vice of acting justly, because acting justly is always the mean, and being drunk is always the excess. Okay, so that means that even though he articulates the mean virtue as being the mean between excess and deficiency, this is what's called the golden mean. It doesn't mean that every possible thing you can think of has a mean. Some things are just too excessive or deficient, and some things are just always virtuous in view of themselves. So what he's saying is we can take a look at the virtues here, and you can see we can think of virtue as this middle point, a sort of teeter-totter between excess and deficiency. Temperance always concerns pleasure and pain, and if temperance is the virtue, then the deficiency of temperance is, for instance, self-indulgence, and the excess of temperance is, for instance, self-denial, neither of which are the virtue or that which is excellent. He also gives a whole bunch of other examples. I don't want to go through them here, but for instance, when you talk about what about taking money when it comes to money, he says liberality is the virtue, but prodigality and meanness are the vices associated with liberality, right? So for instance, someone who's liberal knows when to give their money, but they know when to keep it too. Someone who's prodigal just spends all their money, and someone who's mean is stingy, right? And they just keep it all to themselves. So money, there is a sort of virtue and a mean and an excess and deficiency regarding money as well. There's other virtues including courage, honor, and many, many more. In fact, much of the Nicomachean Ethics is really a sort of catalog of these different virtues. Okay, so that means that there's three kinds of dispositions with regard to action. An action can either be a mean, an action can be an excess, or an action can be a deficiency. And the greatest disparity actually exists between the two deficiencies, not between the mean and the deficiency. And so given by what we tend naturally, some vices will tend to be less likely than the mean. In other words, for instance, take courage as an example. Most people know what the deficiency of courage is. It's cowardice. But most people do not have a good word for the excess of cowardice. In fact, in English, we don't have a word for that, actually. We kind of do, which I usually use is foolhardy, right? Someone who's excessively unafraid is a fool, right? That's the person who runs into battle without a battle strategy. They're not afraid, but they get killed anyway, right? So what you can say here is that most people have the problem with courage, so that's why we have a word for it, cowardice. But most people do not have a problem with excessive courage, and so we don't really have a word for it. Foolhardy, or maybe being, yeah, I don't know. There's other words you can use for that, but we don't have a key word. And it's interesting, neither did they in Greek. And Aerosol suggests, well, this is because by nature, most of us have a problem of deficiency, not of excess, with regard to that particular excellence. In other cases, it might be the reverse, okay? So the deficiency of excess is the sort of example there. So how can we reach the mean? How can we reach the mean? I'm sorry, I'm really embarrassed that I keep finding these spelling and typo errors, but I need to get this video recorded, and so I sort of rushed into it, so my apologies. Again, my third apology here. So the goal is to achieve the mean, right? That's the goal. And he says it's like a circle. The goal is wherever you are on the circle is to find that middle point, to get to the center of the circle, to find that mean. And this is not the foolproof method, but you can say is the first thing you have to do is you have to consider what you get carried away with. Consider with what you're carried away with. So for instance, if you're an alcoholic, then that will tell you what your mean of drinking should be. That is, you shouldn't drink at all, right? Or for instance, if you have a problem with anger, you are a hothead and you get angry fairly easily, then okay, you need to consider that first. So first you have to consider yourself, so that way you can understand your relationship or what's relative to yourself. The second thing is you have to depart from what is the more contrary to it. So whatever is the most contrary to the mean is what you have to stop doing, right? And at a second best aim, if you can't really achieve that, you should choose the lesser of the two evils, right? And you should seek pleasure, he says, as the elders do. So in other words, don't let pleasure guide you in your actions, because pleasure tends to be what gets us in trouble, not what gets us into the right things. So seek pleasure as an elderly person would. That is, seek the things that you should seek pleasure for. So for instance, that means seek pleasure in your education rather than, for instance, in your in the worldly pleasures of drinking and eating fine foods, for instance, or having sex with other people, right? Seek pleasures as the elders do. It's really interesting advice he gives, which I think is quite pertinent, and most of us would probably think, well, that's kind of true, even though we don't maybe do it ourselves. Another thing he says is also just recognize that this is just difficult. Recognize the difficulty. This is difficult to achieve. It's difficult to have knowledge of what the intermediate is, and it's also difficult to differentiate the difference between when we should praise or blame others, or when we think we ourselves should be praised or blamed. So all of this is difficult. So Aristotle recognizes that from the get-go. So if you're watching this and thinking, wow, this is very difficult, I don't know if happiness is cut out for me. It is. It's all difficult for all of us, okay? Let's now go through book 3, and I'll try to go quickly through this so that way we can sort of end the video here. I know that this video is getting fairly long here. Number 1, voluntary action. The first thing we have to do is we have to recognize that if we want to achieve happiness, that means we have to act in such a way in which we can cultivate virtue habitually. That means that that's only possible for things which are within our action, within our possibilities of choice. So that means that some things are within our voluntary, some things are voluntary and some things are involuntary. We praise and blame voluntary action, but we don't make moral judgments about involuntary action. So for instance, if a person is driving their car over the speed limit and they hit and kill someone who's walking across the street and they run a red light, we say that that person was voluntarily negligent, and hence we blame them and we charge them with manslaughter. But if a person is driving at the speed limit and there's a green light and someone jumps in front of them and they have no chance to stop, we say that they committed an action of killing the other person, but it was involuntary. And under those conditions, we don't make a moral judgment against another person. There are other actions which appear mixed, in which you have both the combination of voluntary activity as well as involuntary activity. And so what Aristotle does is he tries to identify voluntary action as always referring to the moment of action. So he gives what I call as a temporal threshold for differentiating what's voluntary and what's involuntary, precisely regarding with what's mixed. Think here with, for instance, if you're a police officer and you see someone commit a crime, you can say that in a certain way that when the police officer arrests you or stops you and then gives you a ticket or something, you can say the police officer might say, I wish I didn't have to do this, but I have to, right? What they're admitting there is that they're giving you a ticket is something which is involuntary because it's related to their job, right? Now, clearly they chose to become a police officer, but insofar as once one is a police officer, some of their actions are no longer their choice. Some of them are, some of them aren't. And so you can see here, we can pin the voluntary to what can be chosen in a particular moment in time, right? So that's how he sort of gets around that problem. And what we can say is that compulsory action, that's action that you're compelled to do, is any action which is A, the cause is based in external circumstance from the individual, and B, it is an action that in which the agent contributes nothing. So, for instance, you can say, for instance, that I don't have a choice about whether or not I pay taxes. Why? Because I pay taxes because there's an external circumstance which causes me to do it, and I don't contribute anything to the fact of whether or not I have to or do not have to pay taxes. You can say that in a certain sense, at the moment I pay taxes, when I actually go down to the post office and I drop my taxes in the mailbox, yeah, at that moment there's a voluntary choice, right? But it's mixed up in a whole range of circumstances which are actually out of my choice. So you can see here is that Aristotle recognizes there's a sort of nuance and a deep complexity to voluntary and involuntary action. But what we can say is that happiness, insofar as it is an end towards which all seek, it is something which is not compulsory. In other words, you don't have to pursue happiness. And you can see that because many people don't pursue it, right? The non-voluntary. Now, there's a sort of interesting distinction here between the voluntary and the involuntary and the non-voluntary, right? Aristotle says, quote, everything that is done by reason of ignorance is non-voluntary. It's only what produces pain and regret that is involuntary, right? So here the notion is sometimes we act and we don't know what we're doing because we act out of ignorance, right? We just don't have the knowledge. And if we don't have the knowledge, that means we don't have the choice. So in those cases, even though we may have acted in one way, because we lacked knowledge of how we ought to act, our actions were actually not involuntary, but they were non-voluntary. So it looks like voluntary action requires some degree of knowledge, right? And he does seem to say here that, quote, acting by reason of ignorance seems also to be different from acting in ignorance, right? So acting by reason of ignorance means that you say you don't know, and so you act in such and such a way. So I can say, I don't know if the murderer is over there, but I'm going to shoot him anyway. Or let's say, I don't know, imagine I say, I don't know if this or that person is trying to steal my money, so I'm going to shoot them, right? There, I started with the reason of not knowing and then acted from that reason. Whereas in other cases, I have other reasons and I act and I have no idea I'm in ignorance. And it looks like one is worse than the other, right? Or at least they're different. In fact, Aerosol goes on to distinguish forms of ignorance. He says you can be ignorant of who you are, or let's say you can have ignorance of who one is. You can have ignorance of what one is doing. You can have ignorance of whom or what one is acting on. You can also have ignorance of what one is doing their actions with. Someone can also be ignorant of the end towards which their actions are contributing, or someone could just be simply ignorant of how they're actually doing something in its relationship. So there's a whole range of ways in which we can be ignorant. Some examples here is to think about anger and appetite. So for instance, anger and appetite are both involuntary. So when I become angry or when I become hungry, those are involuntary. They're not non-voluntary. And those don't have to do with ignorance per se. Okay? So we've got this notion that there's the difference between voluntary and involuntary actions, but this is different from choice because choosing indicates that you have indicates a sort of rational, reasonable process by which one is aware of their voluntary choices and they've made them accordingly. You can say that choice is something that children and animals actually don't have because children and animals lack the requisite knowledge to make choices. But you can say that animals and children have voluntary action, right? They do things on their own accord. So this is sort of interesting here. That means that choice is something that is predicated upon a certain degree of knowledge or a certain capacity. Well, let's say a certain degree and capacity of knowledge, right? Now, what's interesting here is that the incontinent person, and the incontinent person for Aristotle is the person who just can't control themselves, right? So think about the person who just can't help themselves every time they see a slice of cake at the office, right, or whatever. Every time there's a birthday cake, they think, oh, I shouldn't eat that, but they just can't help themselves. That's an incontinent person for Aristotle. And he thinks the incontinent person acts out of appetite. They don't act out of choice, right? And so you can say, so we've all been there, right? Because I've been on diets where I've said, I'm going to eat healthy, and then I see someone puts out a slice of pizza, and I just can't help myself. I haven't chosen to eat the pizza. The thing is, I'm not acting out of choice at all. I'm acting out of my appetites and letting my desires motivate my voluntary activity rather than my reasoning. So choice requires reason and knowledge. And choice is not equivalent to wishing something were the case. Choice can't be an opinion because choice makes one's character evident, and it's not the opinions of a person that we judge, right? So what exactly is choice? Well, in order to understand this, we have to know something about what deliberation is. That is, what sorts of things does one deliberate about? Does one deliberate about eternal things? No, because if they're eternal, they don't change, so what's there to deliberate or choose? People don't deliberate about necessity because, again, there's nothing to choose there. It's necessarily the case that things fall to the ground because of gravity. You don't deliberate and choose to drop a ball, right? A ball just falls to the ground. So you don't deliberate about that. He also says you don't even deliberate about the exact science of a thing because that's determined by the science. In fact, even in human affairs, we don't deliberate about everything. Even something conventional like the Constitution of the United States, we don't deliberate about that. We just take it as a given. So that is, what exactly do we deliberate about? His answer is that we deliberate about what is in our power and about what we can actually do. So what is in our power and what can be done is what we deliberate about. We don't deliberate about ends, but we deliberate about means. So none of us deliberate about whether or not happiness is the goal we're pursuing. What we deliberate about is whether or not this or that thing, action, will get us to happiness. We deliberate about the means or the instruments that lead to happiness, not about the end of happiness itself. Now, he has this interesting discussion that I'm not going to spend too much time on, where he discusses wishes. And it's this notion that wishes are not always for the good. So wishes are not the same thing as deliberating or choosing wisely or anything like this, right? The object of a wish is not always something good because the object of a wish could be something that's simply given by someone's desire, right? So another thing is what you recognize is that wishes are as pluralistic as there are people. In other words, there's as many wishes and desires as there are people in the world. And maybe instead of wish here, you could think about desire, even though he doesn't use that term per se, and say that our desires are not the same things as our choices either. So that means that deliberation concerns that which is within our powers. So the exercise of virtue, the ability to cultivate excellence, is something that has to be concerned with what we can deliberate and choose, and that is actually within our power. And that we have to realize that we make moral judgments about others according to their disposition of voluntary choice and deliberation, not about what is involuntary. So for instance, Aerosol says we don't judge people for being ugly. right? It may be the fact that people are ugly, other people are ugly, but we don't judge them morally because of it. But we do judge people morally based upon what they can voluntarily choose and deliberate about, okay? So notice here that for Aristotle, a key way of thinking about ethics here is always to ask the question of, well, under what conditions can we make a moral judgment? So there's a tight affinity or harmonization here in his discussion between virtue and also the notion of moral judgment. And this means that the virtues are, quote, means, and that they are states, and that they tend by their own nature to the doing of the acts by which they are produced, and that they are in our power and voluntary, and acts as right reason prescribes. So the notion here is that reason is what ultimately should guide right action. Now Aristotle goes on, and he also discusses courage and bravery. And I'm going to be sort of quick about this, because I think that in many ways this is quite intuitive for all of us. He says that the brave have confidence and little fear in the face of the specific difficulties they face. So the person who's brave on the battlefield, right, they have little fear in the face of being potentially killed on the battlefield, right? But he does recognize that death is always the worst of all possible injuries, especially for the good person. And that's because death annihilates the possibility of being in a good or bad state at all. Because remember, happiness is an activity of the soul, and it's ultimately a state of being. If you're dead, you have no state of being. So death is the worst possible injury, he thinks. And that means that the brave are concerned with death in a particular noble circumstance, right? So people who are brave on the battlefield are not concerned with overcoming death when they get cancer in their 80s, right? They're concerned with death in a particular concrete way that's relative to their courage. Okay, so that means that the brave aren't concerned with death in every circumstance. They're only concerned with it in particular circumstances that are related and relevant to what they're doing. And when we talk about the outlook of a brave person, that means that the brave man will, quote, fear even the things that are not beyond human strength. He will fear them as he ought, and as reason directs, and he will face them for the sake of what is noble, and for this is the end of excellence. Okay? So his notion here is that the brave person recognizes and allows reason to guide them ultimately. So the person who's brave is equivalent to the person who faces and who fears the right things and with the right aim and in the right way, and who feels confidence under those corresponding conditions, right? That's the notion, again, you have to have firm and unchanging character, right? So that means that the mean here of courage relates to that which exceeds in fear. The mean who exceeds in fear is the coward, right? So the person who is always in coward, who is always exceeding in fear, is the coward, okay? Now, there are other conditions which resemble bravery and which seem to be similar, and they relate to the excellence of courage, right? Types of courage and the things that resemble courage. He talks about political courage. Right here I was thinking about, there's a great book called The Profiles in Courage by John F. Kennedy. Take a look at it. Great example of what political courage is, civic courage is. Also think of experience with regard to particular facts. So the conditions that are important here is that in order to have excellence in terms of courage or in other conditions, you have to have experience with regard to the particular facts that are related to the concrete case you're in. So you have to have some degree of knowledge. You also have to have a certain sort of passion, a certain sort of emotional state. So for instance, sanguine people are not great. Lots of typos today, my apologies. But he says sanguine people are not brave. And neither are ignorant people, right? Because sanguine people lack the right passion, and ignorant people lack the right sorts of knowledge that you need. So when we think about political courage, this would apply as well. Now, he also discusses the feelings which seem to be proper to the person who is brave. Because it is true that people do have feelings, and what sorts of feelings should be involved? Well, he says the excellence of courage certainly involves pain, right? So for instance, he says the boxer who wants to win the boxing match, right? What they're seeking is ultimately the prize and the honor of winning the match. But in order to get there, they have to endure a lot of pain. And in fact, this seems to be true not only with courage, but with many other virtues. That is, it looks like to cultivate virtue, sometimes one has to endure suffering to a certain degree. And so there's this sort of interesting also problem that Aristotle raises, which is the more virtue one acquires, the more painful one's potential death can become. Because the more virtue one acquires, then that means the greater the excellent the state of being one has attained. But because of that, that means that they have more to lose in dying, because they lose a greater state than the person who doesn't have virtue. Right? Now, all of this can really be applied to another virtue, the virtue of temperance. And the virtue of temperance, Aristotle defines as the virtue of the irrational parts. So think here about your appetites, right? Your hunger, your sexual desires, right? All of your emotions, your anger, all of that kind of stuff. Temperance relates to controlling those. Now, for Aristotle, that means that temperance is concerned with the bodily pleasures. Temperance is about ultimately controlling the body. And temperance governs the pleasures that are shared by the other animals. So for Aristotle, temperance is one of the most basic forms of virtue we can cultivate because it's related to our very bodily state itself, right? Now, what's the outlook of temperance? Now, we can concede the fact that different people enjoy different pleasures. That's clear enough, right? And the excess of pleasure is self-indulgence, right? And the temperate person is not pained by the absence of pleasure. So the person who has self-control doesn't feel a lot of pain when they don't eat that extra slice of pizza or that extra piece of birthday cake, right? But the person who lacks temperance certainly would just keep indulging themselves in it. So what this means then is that, quote, the temperate person, quote, neither enjoys the things that the self-indulgent man enjoys most, but rather dislikes them, nor in general the things that he should not, nor anything of this sort to excess, but does feel pain or of craving when they are absent, or does so nor does he feel pain or craving when they're absent, or does so only to a moderate degree. The notion here is that if you want to know whether or not you're temperate, you have to have a sort of outlook on life in which you're not in total pain when you don't get your desires for pleasure met, and it's also a sort of outlook which doesn't seek self-indulgence for its own sake. Now, intemperance, which is the opposite of being temperate, right? This is a case in which we recognize that self-indulgence is something which is voluntary. So we don't say that, for instance, an infant that wants milk, the milk of its mother, is intemperate, right? Because that is something which is involuntary for an infant. An infant can do nothing else but cry for milk. So that means that self-indulgence is an important criteria. Self-indulgence is something which is voluntary. So that means that children tend to be intemperate insofar as they're ruled by their appetites. Quote, hence the appetitive element in a temperate man should harmonize with reason. For the noble is the mark at which both aim, and the temperate man craves the things he ought, as he ought, and when he ought, for this is what reason dictates. So you can see here is that for Aristotle, once we get a sense that happiness is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, and once we recognize that virtue is a form of excellence that gets habituated into our lives through our activity, but that it's one which is guided by reason, then we can actually begin to inspect the particular virtues, such as bravery or courage or temperance. And what we see there is that reason is a critical feature. It's difficult, but it's something that's actually attainable. Now, at the beginning of the video, we raised the question by looking at the tragedy about, can you live a happy life in a world of uncertainty? And you can see here is that for Aristotle, yes, you can. But the only way in which you can live a life in which a world is uncertain is A, to gain as much knowledge about that world as is possible, and also to habituate and cultivate the best sort of moral virtues you can before a crisis such as a hurricane or a war occurs. You have to cultivate your moral virtues as best you can so that when external circumstances force themselves upon you, you can still potentially be happy. But the upshot also is that for Aristotle, happiness requires a complete life. And so if you have a complete life of misery and tragedy, then no, happiness is not possible, even if you do cultivate these moral virtues. So you can see there's a sort of yes and a no answer here when it comes to Aristotle's ethics. Now, we're going to conclude the video. I've gone way too long here. I apologize for how long this video is. I also apologize for all the spelling errors and whatnot. But I hope this has given you a nice detailed sense here about how Aristotle's progressive discussion on ethics is developing. You'll see in our next video, we're going to take a look at books 4, 5, and 6. I'll try to see if I can simplify and make it a little bit shorter. But thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you guys online.